Hi Year 12s. Here we are in the last little bit of Unit 4 area of Study 1. So this is the last bit of content that you need for the SAC next week. We looked last time at a few global trends to do with climate change and also conflict and mass migration, and particularly looking at how these things impact health and well-being. And today we're going to finish off with looking at increased world trade and tourism and digital technologies. My video should be fairly short today, but in the worksheet I've linked to a few different videos to help you kind of understand these topics a bit better, so make sure you watch those before you answer the questions. Right, so we'll start off with increased world trade. And world trade really is just the exchange of goods and services between countries. So goods is, things like food, clothing, materials, cars, all of that kind of stuff. But services can include things like banking, for example, or technology, even people, so people that move or travel between different countries to provide services is considered part of world trade. For each of the topics that we're going to look at today, we'll go through some positives and some negatives, and then I want you to be able to link these things to health and well-being. So some of the positives of world trade. So firstly, it increases employment. Huge numbers of employment around the world are based on the trade of goods and services. If we increase employment, that can decrease poverty. So people that are employed and earning an income are going to have lower levels of poverty. And those things combined increase economic growth, which we know is really, really important for countries and for the world. Another advantage of world trade is that it allows countries to specialize in industry and innovation. Now, we've talked before about how relying too much on one industry can be a bad thing, but being innovative and being able to come up with new ideas is really, really important for the growth of humans in general, but also to help countries sustain economic growth. Another big advantage is that it can promote gender equality. And I use the word can there because it doesn't necessarily, but definitely world trade has led to a lot of increases in kind of small business. And particularly in recent years, we've seen that impacting women positively quite a lot. So women, especially in kind of lower income countries that are starting their own businesses and being able to earn an income. Some of the negatives of world trade. There's often a lot of social injustices reported. Now, at the end of the day, trade relies on competition and lower prices. If you think about the things that you buy, you'll often choose to buy the cheaper option if there are two options, and that's human nature. But because of that, that can mean that big companies will choose countries perhaps that are very low income because they can get things at a lower price. And if those countries don't have laws in place to protect workers, it can lead to a lot of forced labor, not very much pay, and things like really dangerous working conditions, which is a common thing seen in a lot of low-income countries. There's also a risk of child labour. Again, if countries don't have really strict laws on the age that people can work, how much they can work. In Australia, we have laws around how much people are allowed to work. Other countries might not have that. And if people need money, they will work as much as they need. Child labour is obviously an issue for a lot of reasons, but particularly it can be a really high cause of physical injury in children. And also if children are working, they're not going to school. And we know really well by now how important education is for both health and well-being and also human development. And finally, world trade is a really, really, really big contributor to carbon emissions. So factories, the transport required to move things around, and also a really big cause of pollution. So there's a big kind of focus now on how do we ensure that trade can continue while still protecting our environment and ensuring that sustainability. Okay, so once you've got these written down, jump in and answer questions 1, 2, and 3. Right, next up is tourism. Tourism is looking at the international trade in services, and it relates to people coming to visit a place and receiving those services. It is one of the biggest and fastest growing industries in the world. This year is obviously a very, very different year for tourism, but in general, we're seeing over 1 billion tourists per year, and that number is expected to continue to increase. Some of the positives of tourism are that it creates jobs, and also that decreases poverty and increases economic growth. It can promote peace and stability between countries. And that's a really important thing. When people go to different countries, they learn a bit about that country, and it's in government's best interests to promote tourism between countries, and that relies on them having agreements and kind of helping each other out. Tourism can be a really fantastic way to celebrate culture, diversity, and language. And if any of you have travelled or get the opportunity to travel in the future, you'll be exposed to all of these wonderful different cultures around the world. And tourism can be a really fantastic way to promote that. Also, tourism can, and again I say can, promote environmental protection. There's a branch of the United Nations called UNESCO, and they do a lot of work protecting heritage listed places. So places that are either natural or man-made places that have a lot of significance. So it could be things like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, for example, national parks around the world, or just really important cultural sites. So things like mosques that hold a lot of significance, or really old museums. All of those kind of things can be protected. As with world trade though, there are definitely negatives. So one really big one is that tourism can cause overcrowding. So if you're getting a lot of people going to certain places, that's going to cause overcrowding. And that can really put a strain on local infrastructure. So with things like this, we're talking about, the quality of roads and things like that, but also things like water supplies. If places have a lot of tourists, and especially low-income countries, if they already struggle with things like water and food supplies, that's going to make it even harder, especially for the local people that live there. It can also really increase the cost of living for local people. So generally, low-income countries are much cheaper, and that's why a lot of people in high-income countries go to lower-income countries, because they see a new place, they see a new culture, and things are really cheap. But that brings the cost up for locals living there, and it can actually result in locals having to leave their home and live somewhere cheaper, so moving kind of further out if they can't afford to live in their home anymore. This is a very interesting one this year, but this has been an issue for a long time. But obviously, if we've got people moving all around the world, that can really lead to the spread of transmissible diseases. And I think, you don't need to look too far this year to see that, but obviously it's been the movement of people around the world that has allowed coronavirus to spread so quickly and so easily. It can also be really environmentally hazardous. So we've said on this side that it can protect the environment, but in general, there is a lot of waste that is produced through tourism, a lot of pollution, and even things like the transport from aeroplanes, ships, buses, all of those things contribute a lot to environmental pollution. So it's really, really important that tourism, tries to be more eco-friendly, especially places that aren't protected by things like UNESCO. And the last thing that's worth mentioning is that there's a really high risk of exploitation with tourism. And that can mean a lot of things, but often, people going to another country because they want to see the culture doesn't necessarily take into account the needs of the local community and whether they want people there, whether that's detracting from their normal way of life. And there's also really, really high risks of things like sex tourism, which unfortunately is a very common thing around the world, where people take advantage of local communities in a really negative way. Okay, just go in and answer questions 4 and 5. I've included in there a video of a really beautiful village in northern Vietnam that I had the pleasure of going to. But it's a really interesting look at how tourism, can be really beneficial to local communities, but also it can take a lot of way of local life and traditions. All right, and the last little bit that we're going to look at now is digital technologies. So here we're looking at things like mobile phones, computers, internet, obviously being a huge one, and also like apps, applications, programs, software, all of those things would be considered digital technologies. Now, you were kind of born into the age of digital technology, so you probably don't know any different, but digital technologies is a really new thing for the world, and there's been huge advancements in the last 10 years in terms of what is available and also the cost of those things. Things are getting much cheaper and more accessible. Fun fact, there are more mobile phones on Earth than there are people. Okay, so this is a really, really big global trend. Some of the benefits of digital technologies, especially to do with health, are that it increases access to health information. Okay, so if people have access to the internet, you can access so much really valuable information to do with health, to do with potentially disease, looking after yourself, looking after children. It's really, really important for data tracking. So things like tracking births, tracking deaths, tracking the rates of disease. We spend a lot of time looking at health status and health indicators. Digital technology is what allows us to have that information. And it's also used for keeping records, so individual health records. It's really important in reaching people in really remote areas. And we're starting to see mobile phones and internet reaching the most remote parts of the world. And that allows people who can't access health services to still get information or to be able to communicate with doctors and nurses. It's used a lot to warn people of disasters. Okay, so a lot of countries will have a centralized kind of text message system that will tell people if perhaps there's a tsunami coming and that they need to protect themselves. In Australia, we saw that with the bushfires. People were getting messages to warn them so they can reach safety. And also e-health, which is basically just using digital technologies for health information and record keeping, increases the efficiency in healthcare. You can get messages to lots of people at once. You can make sure that you're not getting lots of people servicing the same communities while other communities aren't getting served. So it really does help the efficiency of healthcare. But once again, there are some risks associated. One is the risk of confidentiality. Okay, confidentiality is really important with healthcare, that people trust that their information is not being shared with anyone that doesn't need it. And when anything becomes digital, that becomes a risk. There's a lot of risks around safety, especially for children. We all know the risks of communicating with people online that you don't know, and that can also come through in digital technologies that can be really useful for healthcare, but also it runs that risk. And the last one, we've set up here that, we get all this access to health information, which is amazing, but also we all know how unreliable a lot of the information on the internet is. So if people don't have the health literacy to understand health messages or to know if a health message is reliable, then people can be receiving and using the wrong information. Okay, there's so many examples of digital technologies. I've just found two, and I want you to choose one of them in the worksheet. Two really short videos that look at how digital technologies can be beneficial. So choose one of them. One is to do with farming, one is to do with maternal health care, and answer question 6. I shouldn't have an S there. And that's it for today. Thanks.